I'm Sarah, just your average 26-year-old working as a manager in a trading company. You wouldn't pick me out in a crowd, short hair, simple style, more into spreadsheets than fashion spreads. That day, sitting in the corner of my favorite cafe with a black coffee and my laptop, I didn't expect anything unusual. Just another day. But life had other plans. The cafe was buzzing with the usual mix of people, some buried in their laptops, others chatting away. Then there was this couple at the next table, catching everyone's attention. The girl, Tina, was in full meltdown mode. "Jake, you're unbelievable. How could you even think of doing that?" She was practically shouting. Jake, a regular-looking guy in a button-up shirt, seemed cornered. "Tina, please, let's not do this here. You're misunderstanding the whole thing," he replied, his voice a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "Oh, am I? Am I really, Jake? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just a two-faced jerk." Tina was not holding back. People around started to take notice. Some shot sympathetic glances at Jake, others just enjoyed the drama. "I'm not two-faced. You're just overreacting like you always do." Jake's tone was rising too, now. "Overreacting? Really? Watch me overreact then." And just like that, Tina grabbed her coffee and threw it right in Jake's face. The cafe went silent for a split second before erupting into murmurs. Jake sat there, coffee dripping down his face, shirt ruined, looking completely lost. Tina stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't just watch. I grabbed a handful of napkins and walked over to Jake's table. "Hey, looks like you could use these," I said, offering the napkins. Jake looked up, a bit dazed. "Thanks," he stammered, taking the napkins and starting to clean himself up. "No problem. People go nuts sometimes, huh?" I tried to sound casual, but inside I felt sorry for the guy. "Yeah, you could say that. I'm Jake, by the way." He managed a weak smile. "Sarah. And, well, it's nice to meet you, Jake, even under these unique circumstances." He chuckled, a sound of relief amidst the awkwardness. Unique is one way to put it. We stood there for a moment, the awkwardness hanging in the air. "You know what? Let me buy you a coffee. The least I can do after, well, that." It was an impulsive offer, but something about this whole scene felt like it needed a better ending. Jake looked at me, a bit surprised. "You don't have to do that." "But, sure. Thanks. I could use another one, minus the facial." We found a new table, away from the scene of the coffee crime. As the waitress brought over 2 fresh cups, we started to talk. Turns out, Jake worked in IT, loved old school rock. He had a way of telling stories that made even the most ordinary things sound interesting. Hours flew by as we talked about everything and nothing. I told him about my job, my love for mystery novels, and my failed attempts at gardening. As the cafe began to empty, we realized we'd been talking for a long time. Exchanging numbers felt like the most natural thing in the world. After the coffee shop debacle, I didn't expect much. Maybe a few texts, a couple of awkward phone calls. But with Jake, it was different. We clicked like we'd known each other for years. A week after the incident, we met up for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a local burger joint. He was there before me, waiting outside. Our banter was easy, comfortable. We ordered our food, and the conversation flowed just as easily as it had in the cafe. We talked about movies, music, and our love for cheesy horror films. Our burgers arrived, and we dug in. Eating with Jake felt like hanging out with an old friend. There was no awkwardness, just laughs and good food. After dinner, we decided to take a walk. The night was warm, and the streets were lively with people enjoying the evening. "So, Sarah, what's your story?" Jake asked, genuinely interested. I told him about growing up in a small town, moving to the city for college, and never leaving. He listened, nodding and asking questions. What about you? How'd you end up in IT? I asked. Well, I've always been the tech guy in the family. Figured I might as well get paid for it, he joked. We walked and talked, losing track of time. It was getting late, but neither of us wanted the night to end. Hey, you want to grab a coffee? Or is it too soon for more coffee-related experiences? Jake asked, a playful glint in his eye. I laughed. Sure, why not? But this time, let's keep the coffee in the cups. We found a late-night cafe and settled in with our coffees. The conversation turned more personal. We shared our dreams, our fears, and our silly quirks. I never thought I'd meet someone like you, especially not in a situation like that, Jake said, his tone serious for a moment. Life's weird. You get coffee thrown at you one day, and the next, you're here with someone who gets you, I replied, feeling a connection I hadn't felt in a long time. As the night turned into early morning, we finally said our goodbyes. Walking home, I couldn't help but feel excited about what the future might hold. Jake wasn't just a guy I met in a cafe, he was someone special, someone who could be a big part of my life. After a few months of dating Jake, it was time to meet his parents. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Meeting the folks is always a bit of a gamble. Jake kept saying they were a bit old-fashioned, but I didn't expect what was coming. The drive to their place was filled with Jake's attempts to prep me. Just ignore any weird comments my mom makes. She's unique, Jake said, glancing at me with an apologetic smile. Unique, huh? That's one way to put it. What should I expect? I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. You know, the usual. Overprotective mom stuff. She might throw in a few odd questions. Just roll with it, he replied. We pulled up to a neat little house with a well-kept garden. It looked welcoming enough. Jake's dad, Mr. Henderson, greeted us at the door. He was a tall, gentle-looking man with a warm smile. Jake, Sarah, welcome. We're so glad you could come. Please, come in, he said, ushering us inside. The living room was cozy, filled with family photos and knickknacks. Then I saw the bookshelf. It was packed with all sorts of books on esotericism, mystical stuff, and one that caught my eye, How to Recognize a Witch. Odd choice for light reading. Jake's mom, Mrs. Henderson, came in from the kitchen. She was a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes that seemed to size me up the moment she saw me. So, you're Sarah. Jake's told us so much about you, she said, her tone polite but cold. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson. Jake's told me a lot about you too, I replied, trying to sound cheerful. We sat down for dinner, and that's when the real fun began. Mrs. Henderson was like a sniper, her comments sharp and targeted. I see you like to keep your hair short, Sarah. Is that for convenience, or are you making a statement? She asked, eyeing my haircut. I was taken aback but managed to reply, oh, just for convenience. Easier to manage, you know? I see. I always believed a woman's hair was her crown, she said, almost dismissively. Jake's dad tried to change the subject. So, Sarah, Jake tells us you're in trading. That must be interesting. Yeah, it's pretty engaging. Markets are always changing, keeps me on my toes, I said, grateful for the change in topic. The conversation moved to safer grounds for a while. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't done yet. So, Jake, what happened to that nice girl you were seeing before? The lawyer, what was her name? Tina? She turned to Jake, a pointed look in her eyes. Jake choked on his water. Mom, I'm with Sarah now. Tina is in the past. Oh, I'm just making conversation. No harm meant, Mrs. Henderson said, but her tone said otherwise. Dinner continued with a few more jabs from Mrs. Henderson. By the time dessert came around, I was ready to bolt out the door. Jake kept giving me apologetic looks, but what could he do? We made our excuses soon after dessert, saying we had a long drive back. Mr. Henderson was a gracious host, thanking us for coming. Mrs. Henderson's goodbye was cooler, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. In the car, Jake was silent for a while before he spoke. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't think she'd be that direct." "It's okay, Jake. I knew it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. But hey, at least we survived, right?" I tried to lighten the mood. "Yeah, survived and learned. Next time, we're meeting at a neutral location. Away from any witch-hunting books," he said, trying to joke. I laughed, but inside, I couldn't help but feel a bit rattled. Mrs. Henderson had made quite an impression, and not a good one. I wondered what I had gotten myself into. Our wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, but it had a shadow hanging over it, Jake's mom, Mrs. Henderson. After that first dinner, things hadn't improved much, and her attitude was always a bit frosty. We'd sent the invite, but deep down, I had a sinking feeling. The ceremony was beautiful, simple but perfect. We had it in a small garden, just close family and friends. But as I walked down the aisle with my dad, I couldn't help but notice the empty seat where Mrs. Henderson should have been. Jake noticed too, I could see it in his eyes. After the ceremony, during the reception, Jake pulled me aside. "Hey, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry my mom didn't show. I know it means a lot to have everyone here," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment. I took his hand. "Hey, it's okay. Today's about us, remember? Not who's not here. Let's just enjoy our day." He smiled, but I could tell he was hurt. "You're right. Let's make the most of it." The rest of the evening went by in a blur of congratulations, dancing, and laughter. But there was a moment, just before the cake cutting, when Jake's dad, Mr. Henderson, came over. "Sarah, Jake, I just want to apologize for my wife's absence. I know it's not ideal, but please know, she wishes you well," he said, his eyes sincere. "We appreciate that, Mr. Henderson." "Thank you for being here," I replied, trying to keep the mood light. "Call me John, please. And I wouldn't miss this for the world. You two are perfect for each other," he said, giving us both a warm smile. Despite the snub from his mom, our wedding day was everything I'd hoped for. It was the start of our new life together, just me and Jake, against whatever the world threw at us. And I couldn't have been happier. A few weeks into our married life, Jake and I had settled into our cozy apartment. Life was smooth until an unexpected invitation arrived from Jake's mom, Mrs. Henderson, for a dinner at their place. Considering her absence at our wedding, this was a surprise. Saturday evening, we arrived at Jake's parents' house. The familiar neat garden, the well-kept house, it all seemed too normal. Mrs. Henderson greeted us at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, Jake, Sarah. So glad you could come," she said, her tone polite but strained. We sat down for dinner in their dining room, the air filled with the aroma of roasted meat and herbs. Mr. Henderson was his usual welcoming self, trying to make small talk. Mrs. Henderson, however, had a different agenda. "So, Sarah, how's the married life? Must be a change from your single days," she started off, eyeing me critically. "It's wonderful, thank you. Jake and I are very happy," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "That's nice to hear. Marriage is a serious commitment, after all," she said, her eyes flickering towards Jake. Then, without any warning, she dropped a bombshell. "You know, Jake, I bumped into Tina the other day. Remember her? Your ex? She's doing quite well. A shame things didn't work out between you two," Mrs. Henderson said casually, as if this was normal dinner conversation. Jake's fork clattered against his plate. Mom, why are you bringing this up now? That's not appropriate. Mrs. Henderson continued, ignoring Jake's discomfort. I just think it's a shame. Tina was such a perfect match for you, beautiful, smart. Not to mention, her family background is impeccable. I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. This was beyond inappropriate. Mrs. Henderson, I don't think this is the right time or place to discuss Jake's ex-girlfriends, I interjected, trying to stay calm. She turned her sharp gaze on me. Oh, but I think it's very appropriate, Sarah. After all, I wonder how my son, who was so in love with such a perfect girl, ended up with, well, you. Jake slammed his hand on the table, standing up. Mom, that's enough. You can't talk to Sarah like that. Mrs. Henderson didn't back down. Oh, I'm just stating the facts. It's almost like she bewitched you. You were never like this before. Bewitched? Really, Mom? This is ridiculous, Jake exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. Yes, bewitched. You were always such a rational boy. And then you meet Sarah and suddenly everything changes? It's like she's cast a spell on you, Mrs. Henderson accused, her eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and unspoken accusations. I felt sick to my stomach. Jake and I quickly excused ourselves after that, not even finishing dinner. Life after the dinner fiasco was a mix of anger and disbelief. Jake and I had agreed to keep our distance from Mrs. Henderson for a while. But as they say, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. It was a lazy Sunday morning, and Jake and I were lounging in our living room, still in our PJs, when we heard a knock on the door. I peeked through the peephole and my heart sank. It was Mrs. Henderson. I shook my head, opening the door reluctantly. Mrs. Henderson, what a surprise. Is everything okay? Oh, Sarah, Jake, I just wanted to talk. May I come in? She asked, her voice unusually soft. We exchanged a glance, both of us hesitant. But we let her in, not wanting to cause a scene outside. We sat in the living room, an awkward silence filling the space. Mrs. Henderson was the first to break it. I know the last time we met didn't go well. I wanted to apologize. I may have overstepped, she started, her voice low. Jake raised an eyebrow. Overstepped? Mom, you accused Sarah of witchcraft. I know, and I'm sorry. It's just, I worry about you, Jake. You're my son. And Sarah, I may have misjudged you, Mrs. Henderson said, looking at me. I wasn't sure if I bought it. Misjudged? Mrs. Henderson, you called me a witch and suggested Jake go back to his ex. She nodded, her eyes on her lap. I know, and I regret it. I want us to start over, be a family. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Mom, it's not that simple. What you said hurt both of us. It's going to take time to get past that. I understand. I just want you to know, I'm willing to try. For the sake of our family, she insisted, her voice earnest. We talked for a bit longer, the conversation strained but polite. Mrs. Henderson kept saying she wanted to make things right, but something about it didn't sit well with me. It all felt a bit too rehearsed. As the day went on, I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling. Something about her visit didn't add up. It was too sudden, too out of the blue. And then I noticed it, my favorite comb was missing, and so was the handkerchief I kept on the dresser. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off as being forgetful. In the weeks following Mrs. Henderson's odd visit, a peculiar pattern emerged. She started calling me regularly, which was strange in itself, given our strained relationship. But it was the nature of her inquiries that really unsettled me. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, my phone rang. Seeing Mrs. Henderson's name on the caller ID, I braced myself for the conversation. Hello, Mrs. Henderson, I greeted, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Sarah, dear, how are you feeling? Everything okay, with your health?" Her voice carried an unusual note of concern. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you. Just busy with usual stuff," I replied, slightly confused by her interest in my well-being. "That's good to hear. Do take care," she responded, her tone dropping to what sounded like disappointment before she hung up. These calls became a regular occurrence, each one echoing the last. She would ask about my health, and upon hearing I was fine, her voice would deflate in a way that suggested she was hoping for a different answer. Jake found it strange too, but he suggested maybe his mom was trying to mend things in her own way. Then, out of the blue, Mrs. Henderson invited us over for dinner. Jake was hesitant, given her recent behavior, but he thought it might be a chance for her to make amends. We arrived at their house on a cool Friday evening. Mrs. Henderson greeted us at the door with a polite smile, but I noticed a tense look in her eyes. During dinner, the conversation was stilted, filled with awkward pauses. Then, Jake, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Mom, I've actually been feeling unwell lately. Just can't seem to shake this cold," he said, a hint of frustration in his voice. The moment he said that, Mrs. Henderson's face drained of color. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hand went to her mouth, and she staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the table for support. "Jake, what do you mean you've been sick?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with shock. "Yeah, it's been a few weeks now. Just a persistent cold, but it's annoying," Jake explained, looking concerned at his mother's reaction. Mrs. Henderson swayed on her feet and then, to our utter shock, fainted right there in the dining room. After Mrs. Henderson regained consciousness, a tense silence hung over the room. Her eyes, red and watery, were fixed on Jake, who looked both worried and confused. "Mom, what's going on? Why did you faint like that?" Jake asked, his voice laced with concern. Mrs. Henderson took a deep, shaky breath. "I have to confess something," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did something terrible because I thought Sarah was." Jake urged her to continue. "Thought Sarah was what, Mom?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then continued with a tremble in her voice. "I thought Sarah had bewitched you. So, I made a voodoo doll to get rid of her, but I think I used your hair by mistake." The room fell into a stunned silence. I felt a chill run down my spine. "A voodoo doll? Of me?" I managed to say, my voice trembling with disbelief and shock. "Yes," Mrs. Henderson whispered, reaching under her chair to pull out a small, crudely made doll. Strands of hair were tied around it, and its appearance sent a wave of dread through me. Jake's face turned from concern to horror. "You did what? Mom, that's insane. You can't seriously believe in that stuff." Mr. Henderson, who had been quiet, now stood up, his face a mix of shock and anger. "Martha, what have you done? This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Jake was visibly shaking with anger. "I can't believe this, Mom. You've taken your superstitions too far. I can't deal with this right now." He stood up abruptly, signaling that we were leaving. I followed him, still in shock, barely able to process what had just been revealed. The next few days were a blur. We saw a doctor, who confirmed Jake just had a bad flu. Mrs. Henderson's actions, while disturbing, had no real impact on his health. Over the next few days, Jake didn't speak to his mother. He was deeply hurt and couldn't come to terms with her actions. His father, Mr. Henderson, called us a few days later. He was distraught and apologized profusely for his wife's behavior. He revealed that he was considering a divorce, unable to live with the reality of what she had done. We knew that moving forward, things would never be the same with Jake's family. But we also knew that as long as we had each other, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The incident with the voodoo doll was a shocking revelation, but it also reinforced the strength of our bond.